Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're sitting down with a repeat guest, one of the resident poets of the What If Project, the one and the only Darrell Epp. So Darrell, welcome back to the show. It's always good to connect with you.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me back on. This is great.
Absolutely. So you have a new collection of poems out called Alien Phonics Primer, a fantastic title, by the way. And so I was wondering if you could begin by telling us a little bit about why this title, what's the theme of the poems, what big ideas are you addressing in the world? Because that's one of the things I've come to really appreciate about your poems in particular is that you're a master at taking this handful of words and arranging them in a way that speaks to the heart of issues that we're all experiencing every day, whether we realize it or not. So, what issues are we exploring? What's the title about? Wade us into the waters.
Okay. Well, there's a few questions there, and the
Mhm.
first one is the easy one to answer. So, why is the book called Alien Phonics Primer? It's because uh, one thing that I was concerned about that is kind of clear is that I'm concerned with the way technology has made it harder for us to talk to each other about important things. So I thought, logically enough, the book should be called Alien Phonics Primer because basic uh, ways of communicating are just being lost, and like you have seen more uh, uh, technological change in your lifetime than the past 15 generations of seaperts did. That's just a fact.
Yep.
So whatever that means, it doesn't mean nothing. It means something.
Yep.
So it's called Alien Phonics Primer because once again, I'm talking about the way technology has changed the way we live, organize our communities, communicate, and all that fun stuff. Yeah.
Mm. Why is that like why was that like something that was big on your mind to address in your poetry? Like, when I read your poetry, you could see that these topics matter to you. So I guess my question would be, why does that matter to you so much to write a collection of poems addressing it?
Well, it's kind of funny. Uh, like you know how Sam Peckinpah made movies about cowboys,
Hmm.
and he did that very well. And his grandparents were literally pioneers,
Hmm.
and he literally did grow up putting shoes on horses before he went to kindergarten. So when he wanted to talk about his themes and he needed some sort of authentic sense of tropes to hang it on, that made sense. And I love cowboy movies, but I'm not a cowboy. I'm never going to be. So my cowboy movie wouldn't have the same authenticity, right?
Yep.
So when I started writing, I started talking about my romantic adventures, the common boy meets girl things that everybody does, um, which is natural. And then as time went on and my skill level improved, I thought I didn't want to do that anymore and write
Hmm.
autobiographical poetry. Like, no, no, no. So I thought with every book I write, I want to make it harder for myself, to make it more interesting for myself,
Yep.
and sort of push my imagination. Um, so um, One reason I recommend that everybody who's listening to this should write books. Just do it. It's a great way to learn about yourself. Where now that I've published 6 books, I can actually flip through them and say, "Oh, it turns out I'm obsessed with X. Now I know." Right. So the big theme question is kind of funny. Where I've said this a few times. I hope not last time I was here, because then people just think I'm losing my mind, getting.
No.
But there's a great playwright named Sam Shepard who was
Mm.
also a short story writer and an actor. And back in the day, he was very prolific writing plays. And they said to him, of course, "Where do you get your ideas?" And he said, "That's backwards." Where he said, "I write plays because I'm in the habit of writing plays, like
Mhm.
smoking. And once in a while, I look over my shoulder and say, oh, yeah, look, there's an idea back there." Right. So First off, writing is about labor. Where like this is about the whole um, AI thing, and one objection people have to it is that they think the idea is a big deal. Well, no, the idea is nothing, right? Like the labor is where the magic is. Like how many movies have there been about a bank robbery or a heist that didn't work out, right? Like the idea doesn't matter; it's how well it's executed, right?
Mm,
So the theme question is kind of interesting. Like sometimes the theme finds you, right? And
mm.
um, when I was writing this book, I had a friend who actually asked me um, what the theme was, and it made me laugh because I write a book, and when it's finished, I think to myself, "Good Lord, I hope the readers can tell me that." Right?
Right. Hope that comes across.
Yeah, yeah. So I actually answered him by saying a big theme in my writing is fear of being homeless um, because of inflation and
Mm,
um, uh, the way prices are rising. Um, More and more people I know are winding up homeless or committing suicide. Meanwhile, if you go through the news feed, that's not what's there. It's all about, did you hear what Taylor Swift said today? Or so and so. So I thought, that's interesting.
Yeah, I'm reading this book right now called The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. And it
Wow,
kind of, the book really kind of goes in line with a lot of the poems in your book.
cool.
And, it's just really kind of magnifying how, a lot of us grew up with more play-based childhood where we spent time outdoors. We were on the swing sets, we were playing games in the woods, we're having fun as kids outside. And now a lot of kids are inside on a screen. And how, although there might be some communication through the screen with other people, there's a real lack of that face-to-face communication where children learn and we all learn to develop our personalities. We learn how to communicate with people and how that's really having a negative effect on the generation. And so the book, like I said, the book just magnifies a lot of things that you bring out poetically in your
Cool,
book.
cool, cool.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll definitely check that book out. That sounds great.
Yeah,
And
highly recommended.
right on.
So rather than talk about these things, I could ask you, to talk about, some different instances where you've observed how technology kind of, has this negative impact, things like that. But why don't we just go to some of the poems in the book? And one of the poems that was my favorite is very early on, and it's called Parachutist Impaled on Rhino Horn, which again is a great title. All your titles are always great. But since you're the poet, I was wondering if you could read it for us, and then maybe we can explore it a little bit if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. And the talk where we go into detail about the themes, the state of world today, the 9 hour version will be on the director's cut of the
Right.
DVD as a bonus. Yeah. So watch out for that on Blu-ray.
That's right.
Yeah. So, parachutist impaled on rhino horn. The
Mm,
house of Frankenstein's been remodeled past all recognition. Fake sand on a fake beach chokes the native topsoil. Security reprimanded me for crying in front of the tourists. But what else could I do when they replaced our first Dairy Queen with an inflatable giant hand advertising luxury condos? Parachutist impaled on rhino horn crawls across the bottom of the screen, and the family dog leaves us for a scuba diver with an open top Jeep. The midnight laundromats I haunted, the caterpillar I trapped in a bottle, then forgot to feed.
mm,
Is this part of the gag? The sad clown asks the bylaw enforcement officer. How will I know when you're about to let go? The plum asks the branch. When in doubt, I always checked off all of the above, stuffed my pockets with free packets of butter at the Mandarin buffet. The thing about high school is picking the right locker. The thing about funerals is there are too many of them. Today, I confused Canada with a jigsaw puzzle dropped from a great height. A cartoon coyote hangs in the air, silently asks the cruel camera for mercy. Melanie hits me with a flower. I pretend it doesn't hurt. Most of the bleeding's internal anyway. The Joker couldn't stop laughing even if he wanted to.
All right. There's a lot going on in this poem. We've got Frankenstein, we've
Yep,
got
yes,
Dairy Queen, we've got a
yep.
coyote who is, Wile E. Coyote, we've got the Joker. Take us into the thought process of this poem and maybe share, and then I'll share a few things that maybe jump out at me. What's going on
Yeah,
in this poem?
yeah. I was going to say I'd be more curious to know why you liked it, but whatever.
I could start if you want.
Oh, okay, great. Take the pressure off me.
There you go. Well, I mean, for me, like I love the image that you paint. When you say like, what else could I do but cry? When they replaced the first Dairy Queen with an inflatable giant hand advertising luxury condos.
Mm,
Um, my favorite band, I have this sweatshirt on. Green Day is my favorite band. I was just at their
right on.
concert a couple weeks ago, but they have a new album out called Saviors, and the first song on the album is called "The American Dream Is Killing Me." And there's this one line, I wanted to read it for you,
Great.
but it says, "Send out an SOS. It's getting serious. Bulldoze your family home. Now it's a condo. We are not home. The American dream is killing me." And I feel that like same sentiment of your poem kind of coming through that song is that we have like this desire to build, to accumulate, to make things better, bigger, newer, brighter, flashier screens, all this different stuff. But like, do we consider the cost of what it's doing to our hearts, to our lives, to our souls when we take a bulldozer to the way things maybe used to be in order to attempt to create something that's new and something that's better? And so again, this the sentiment that kind of runs through that song, I felt that same vibe coming through the poem, and it just kind of captured me because I've had those moments in my own life where I've gone past the childhood place and it's gone. And now there's this big thing that's there in its place and it does something inside. It's something, and we often press it down because we're like, oh, we have to move on with the times and things are better and bigger. But like there's something inside, I feel like that dies. And so that's what captured me.
Cool. That's very cool. Yeah. Um, I'll go along with that. Uh, what can I say? You know what's funny? When you read, for example, Emily Dickinson, her
Hmm.
poems are very much not plugged into like current events, and like nobody would say, "Oh, her time would have been better spent writing poems about the civil war that was raging on around her, or about taking a stand on the issues of the day," because you read her and it's like she's talking about things that are timeless, that will be
Hmm.
relevant for as long as there's humans, right?
Yep.
And sometimes when you try to write something topical or of the moment, that actually doesn't work. It has to be a natural, thing, right? So I always had this thing in my art where I'm like, I'd prefer to, maybe live in a lighthouse or an island and never go outside and just write art that isn't really plugged into the current culture, because the current culture really wasn't for me, right? But then it turns out that there are some things that are going on that, they're so strong and powerful, they just seep in there. So when people say to me, "Oh wow, why do you always talk so much in your book about gentrification or condo towers or the Rust Belt and what's going on in Ohio, for example?" Um, I just feel like saying, what hippy dippy happy planet are you living on, right? Like it's like it's just there, and it's sort of like it's this giant monster in the room,
Mm,
and I just can't sort of ignore it.
mm,
Where the thing is, the world has drastically changed um, in your lifetime, and your childhood, as you've noticed, is very different from your kid's childhood
mm,
in all sorts of ways. So, so there it is, right? And so on the one hand, I'm thinking, yeah, this is a fact I have to address, and also for me, the energy that keeps me going writing books is the technical challenge of
mm,
giving myself a problem and then seeing I can solve it. And the problem is, how do you talk about this stuff without just sounding like the Unabomber manifesto?
Right.
Where if you deal with this stuff without craft and
Mhm.
without humor, that's what it sounds about. Like that's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
Um, where like things were better in the old days. Abraham Simpson yells at cloud, right?
Hmm.
It's like that. So I've noticed my world changing in certain ways that are alarming, just like you have. So then I'm like, I don't want to write a sermon about it or a nonfiction about it because I don't think that's really how brains work or how minds are changed. So my challenge is how do I document 2024? Um, but and this is something I insist on. Um, Talk honestly about what do you want to call it, inequality or evil or whatever, but I insist on doing it with joy and humor.
Mm.
So yeah, so that's where it's at.
Yeah. And that's the fine line to walk, right? Is that, I mean, we have all these technological advances in the world. And we can't say that it's all bad because you and I are having this conversation right now and recording this conversation that lots of people will be able to listen to around the country, maybe even around the world. We wouldn't be able to do this in the 80s, but we can do it now, and it's really great. But then there's the other aspect, like things that come out in that book that I'm reading and stuff, that technology is a real, let's just face it, can be a real evil in a lot of different ways and a lot of different when it gets in the hands of certain people and certain things are done with it. So it's like the walking that fine line of missing what was, marching forward to what is, and what do you bring with you, what gets left behind. And I feel like it's like a spider web of a mess in my brain, especially as I watch my daughter who's 7, she's growing up and she has her iPad and stuff, she plays her games, but there's even kids in her school, 8, 9 years old, they have phones, and they don't have parental controls on these phones and they're just doing whatever it is that they want to do on these phones. And it's like that horrifies me, because I used to work at Apple, the company that makes a lot of these phones. And I used to sell these phones and know a lot about these phones. And so seeing these phones in the hands of these kids is in a lot of ways horrifying and alarming to me.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting angle in the book you're talking about, where I thought we agreed that the purpose of society is to protect the innocence of children.
You know?
Like what? And and yeah, Apple is evil, and Steve Jobs was an evil man who didn't let his own children use the products that he sold to other kids
Yep.
because he knew about neuroplasticity and addiction and all this stuff. So it's like, oh, it's okay for me to get rich from harming other people's kids, but that's not good for my kids.
Yep.
And that's very much what it's about, right?
Yep.
And it's like if you were insane, how would you know? Okay. Now, your identity is based on relationships to others and comparisons. You can only know if you were insane if you compared yourself to other people. But the thing is, a pathology becomes universal. Once a pathology becomes universal, it immediately becomes invisible. Where 80 years ago, there was a horror movie made in England called Peeping Tom.
Mm.
And keep in mind, I said horror movie. And the plot of this movie, it's going to freak you out. It's about a guy who likes to uh, sexually spy on strange ladies. And that's it.
Mm.
And 80 years ago, that was a nightmare scenario. And now, thanks to improvements in technology, we're all peeping Toms.
Yep.
So you're like, that's a horror movie? No, that's normal. That's my life, right? We're all
Yep.
peeping Toms, and we don't realize it's horror because we're all in the same boat. And this whole thing about, you know, 12-year-old girls killing themselves because they were cyberbullied,
Mhm.
right? And like, yeah, that's pretty insane. And, you know, um, the epidemic of suicide, that's not normal. That's never happened before. Um, And there's never been a generation of young people for the past 2.5 million years who get less sunlight
Hmm.
in this current generation.
Yep.
But because it's all they've ever known and they aren't comparing themselves to the past 2 million years, they just think that's how you live,
Yep.
hiding from the sun, hiding from people, hiding.
Yep. Yeah, you bring up an interesting point about just how this technology has warped our sense of morality in a lot of ways
For
because,
sure.
in that book again, it talks about some different, I guess, files that were locked away from different studies around Meta, like Facebook and Instagram, things like that, and how a lot of the people, I guess, who were on the founding, I don't know what the terminology is, like committee of the team that kind of put these apps together and kind of brainstorm these ideas, like they looked into a lot of modern psychological studies where they learned things about dopamine in our brains and things like that, and how they figured out ways that they could make this app trigger these responses in the human brain and then suck people in. And they even said that they did it with kids in mind, teenagers who they know whose brains are not fully developed and their
Right.
frontal cortex is not fully developed. They're making these decisions that, they probably would make when they're adults, but they took all this kind of stuff into consideration, built this app with the idea to kind of draw these people in. And it's like you said, like, aren't we all supposed to be on the same page that like our children are sacred? Like we're really taking advantage of their lack of human development just because of where they are in their age. And we're exposing that and we're using that, we're manipulating that in order to make this app that's going to make us money. Like, it's, what I mean? Like, it's just like, what has happened to our morality?
That's right.
And
That's
would that have ever happened had these apps, these devices, the technology not have come? Or maybe would have happened in another way. Who really knows? But what's happened to us?
Oh yeah, and make no mistake, your child might stop growing taller by the age of 18, but the front part of the brain, the part that deals with decision making and being able to plan for the future, and weighing pros and cons, that is not fully developed until the age of 25.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
literally. Okay,
Yep.
so protecting your children is the most important thing in the world, right?
Yep.
And yeah, these are, bad actors do exist. These aren't good guys who said oops, right? Like, for example, when Jeff Bezos founded Amazon as a bookstore, it was not because he was a nerd who loved books. It wasn't because he was a book lover. It was because the publishing business was already so shady and corrupt. He saw something he could take advantage of, where how a big publishing has this like remaindering system where you have like a rolling credit going back and forth. Basically, he could sell books at a total loss until his competitors were driven out of business, and then uh, like back in the day, he was selling books for 1 penny, and then the shipping was $8, but the book was 1 penny. So of course people bought it. And then when books and bricks and mortars bookstores went out of business, guess what? You can't find books on Amazon for a penny anymore,
Yep.
right? And the people who made social media, it wasn't a byproduct. They learned about dopamine first,
Yep.
and then created the social media. Yeah, it wasn't like, oh man, I'm a nerd. I like trying new things. Oops, dopamine. I've never heard of that. What is that? No, it's totally backwards. They knew about neuroplasticity first
Yep.
and saw something they could take advantage of.
Yep. It's like, how can we trigger this thing that we know about in the human brain to benefit us, draw people in, and get them addicted to it? That's really what it
Oh,
is. Yeah.
oh, oh yeah. And when the world ends, it's going to be because just before the world ends, there's going to be the sweet spot of a year where like 10 dudes get super rich.
We're already
Yeah, yeah,
there. We've arrived. We've
yeah.
arrived. All right. So how about you? What give me one of your poems in the book that's, your favorite? Obviously, it's probably an unfair question because you wrote the book, you wrote all the poems. But if there's one, if you had a somebody said to me, Darrell, if someone said to you, Darrell, talk to me about this book, give me a taste of it. What poem would you go to?
Okay. Um, this is a poem called "The Teardrop Collector Appreciates Your Business."
Mm,
A pine cone hits the ground with a baleful thud, and suddenly I wish I was wearing a tuxedo. Grinder's cat plays with a discarded Coke can. Attic dormers leer at us like jack-o'-lanterns. As the worm chews through the calendar, cruel time drops the cosmetic camouflage. This is what you want, this is what you get. Dear Big Bang, let me talk to your manager, preferably sometime before this ashy soil and the ash I'm made out of are terminally reunited. And where have all the inventors gone? There used to be crackpots with flying machines lined up around the block, just waiting for the patent office to open. If cold fusion's out, how about a bloom that never fades? But I know I've always been greedy. Atoms from the sun, like angels on parole, boil away my tears.
mm. So, talk to me. Why is that poem meaningful to you? What's going on?
Okay. Well, first off, uh, I actually had an experience
Mm,
where I thought was noteworthy. And people say, "How do you write a poem? Do you have an idea or something you want to write about?" And that never happens to me. And I always think that's a mistake when people say, "I want to write a book about X," or This book is important because it talks about this issue." And I was always a big fan of, if I'm surprised, there's a better chance the reader's going to be surprised.
mhm,
So, in this one specific case, I actually had this experience of, I was on my bicycle and I went by a house where someone I used to know used to live, and then she died. And I couldn't remember if her address was 198 or 200. And these two houses looked identical. So I thought, back in the day, I was in the house. And like, which house is it?
mm,
And I guess I'm losing my memory. And I thought, yeah, someday I will remember less about her. And that was kind of like alarming.
mm,
So I thought some people would just write a poem about that experience because it really, was a big deal for me. But then I thought, that's not my project. So what if I could give people the sense of that experience without actually talking about me, right?
mm,
Because everyone has had this experience about having a key memory for you fade, or like we talked a bit before about your old Dairy Queen being bulldozed,
yeah.
or whatever. So I thought, yeah, just like talk about that, right?
Mm,
So also, a long game project with my writing is to make people pay more attention to their surroundings in general.
mhm,
So if I just point out the objects that make up your day that you pass by because you're in a rush, all those objects are actually strange and unique and interesting. So, what if you just stopped and stared for a while?
mm,
So, people notice my books. They have a science fiction flavor because the world is science fiction now.
mhm,
But then, oftentimes, my narrator will stop to look at forsythias or hydrangeas or plums or whatever, or just branches. And that's actually one thing I am serious about, where I think leaves on trees are really interesting. And like I said before, there are trending topics when you wake up that have been decided for you, right?
yep.
Like, oh, good Lord, did you hear what Taylor Swift did while you were sleeping? You got to know this, right?
Yep.
So, one way to push back on that is to actually, first off, you have to be conscious, because if you're just sleepwalking through your day, that real estate will be colonized by Taylor Swift or whoever by default. So, if you actually say, no, 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 those trending topics are not important, but plum trees are important. Um, uh, Lilac blooms. I'm going to sit here and stare at this lilac bloom, right? If you stare at a lilac bloom today for 10 minutes, that's 10 minutes in which you aren't getting updated on Taylor Swift or Ted Cruz, and you aren't getting agitated about the words of strangers 3,000 miles away.
Yeah.
And, life is a brutal zero sum game where time is the one hard currency you have, where if you're doing this, you're not doing that, right?
Yeah.
And you can't go back, right? So it's pretty brutal. But at the very least, if you spend some time today marveling at a leaf, that's 10 minutes where you're not being agitated about stuff you can't control and stuff that doesn't matter and
That's
stuff
right.
that's ephemeral
Yeah.
and will be replaced by other trending topics tomorrow, anyhow.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I had a aha moment not that long ago because I had read something from some like mental health professional, but they were saying about how, their advice was to not open up news apps on your phone or even social media apps on your phone for the first like hour or so that you're awake, because there's a lot of people who they're finding, and they do all these different surveys and stuff where people say before they even get out of bed, they're just like under the blanket scrolling through Twitter or X, whatever, and Instagram and the news apps, and right away, you're like you said, you're it's already dictated for you
Right.
what's going to be on your mind when your feet hit the floor. And so I had that like aha moment where figure out I'm just not going to open up these apps for the first hour or so that I'm up.
Oh,
And my
yeah.
mind went to all these other places. When it wasn't there was nothing, there was no screen dictating for me what was important for me to think about today. My mind
Absolutely.
went to all these other things where I was more focused on, even like what my daughter's day at school was going to be like while I was making getting her lunch together. What I was going to do, when I dropped her off to come home and, you know, get more into this book that I'm reading. Like my mind went to all these different kinds of places as opposed to making her lunch, thinking about the latest thing that Donald Trump said, or, whatever the thing might be. And that was just a real aha moment for me because I thought to myself, what if we had less of this dictator dictating for us what to think about in our day? Like where would we be able to better direct our energies if we didn't
For
have
sure.
that dictation all the time?
Yeah. Do you know C.S. Lewis? He was a pretty smart fellow, and uh, he read a lot of books, was a professor, blah blah blah. And 70 years ago, he said that he never, ever, ever read newspapers.
Hmm.
And he said, and they asked him why, and he said, two reasons. He said, none of it matters, and none of it is true. And he said that 70 years ago.
Yep.
And like now people talk about fake news and all this stuff. It's like, no, no, no. He was from a different world. He was
Yeah.
trying to say something different that we don't that like we can't even really process right now.
Yep.
But he was saying if you read something like, you know, uh, Mallory's book about King Arthur or whatever, which he really liked, or Gilgamesh or Homer. That's true in the sense that it's about people who have desires, struggles against their own selves, struggles against the other,
Yep.
things that will always be true. But he said, what's in a newspaper today, it doesn't matter and it's not true,
Yep.
right? Where like, sure, like it's not, and also it's like, is a fact true, right? Um, if someone says you have to know what Taylor Swift said last night, right? It's like, how could that knowledge possibly in a million years ever benefit you?
Hmm.
But what's the emergency, right? And 100 years ago, G.K. Chesterton said things about newspapers where he was so vehemently opposed to them, it was like he was talking about the internet today,
Mm.
right? So very much like like the way we were talking about, you have a job to protect your child, because like it's funny. Like if the first time you see the internet, you're our age, you're like, okay, whatever, and then you're going to waste a huge amount of your life scrolling. But um, for a child, do you know how they always say if you want to learn a foreign language, the most important thing is to do it before you're 10?
Mm. Yep.
By far. And if you ever meet someone who mastered a foreign language as an adult, that takes real intelligence,
Yep.
because the brain cells have like specifically assigned roles,
Yep.
but if someone's under 10, they can really soak it up, right?
Yep.
So it's like, um, you gave Candy Crush to a 4-year-old? What?
Yeah.
That's odd, you know?
Yeah. I remember when I was in seminary taking Greek and Hebrew, it was some people were able to pick up things pretty quick, but man, it was like trying to like learn these different language rules and stuff was just I could not do it. It was rough.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, that's
All
true.
right,
Yeah.
last question for you. I know that you're big into Shakespeare, and so I wanted to ask you, first of all, why? What is it about Shakespeare that draws you in? And then secondly, I know you've told me in the past as well that Shakespeare kind of makes his influence known in your writing and in your poems. So I'm curious as to how Shakespeare has influenced this particular book and this particular set of poems.
Okay. Yeah, I guess you'd like to wrap this up in about 10
You could
minutes.
write like a dissertation on this, right? This is your wheelhouse.
Yeah. Make sure to attend my 9-hour TED talk
That's
on you and
right.
Shakespeare
I'll
sometime.
just
Yeah.
go like this when I need time.
Yeah. Yeah. Get the hook. Yeah. So basically, uh, Orson Welles, who was one of the great geniuses of the 20th century, who made Citizen Kane and about half a dozen other movies just as good, he once said that William Shakespeare was the greatest human being who ever lived, and that Falstaff was the greatest fictional character ever created in the history of literature. And I would agree with that. Reading Shakespeare, it's kind of like falling through the black monolith in 2001, where it is like going into this other world where everything is just sharper and more meaningful. Um, People like Shakespeare because he has a lot of quotes. There are teachers like to teach him to kids because there's a lot of meaningful stuff. But he was a master of swaddling the profound bits
Mm,
into a package that was so entertaining you wouldn't notice.
mm,
Where in real life, as soon as someone starts preaching, a normal person's like, "Oh, you're trying to sell me something," and they sort of turn you off.
mm,
But Shakespeare was a genius at telling you things that are urgent and timeless and true. But because his work is so full of narrative drive, it doesn't feel that way.
mm,
So, like, for example, there's a bit where Hamlet says, "What is a man if the chief market of his time be but to sleep and feed?" And it's said in a really dramatic moment in a very dramatic story. So you're like, yeah, right on. Um, when's he going to stab them? When's he going to get to the action or whatever, right? But it's a good question that every human has to wrestle with.
mm,
So the idea is that uh, once in a while, you get the impression that maybe there's more to life than eating and going to the bathroom and trying to acquire enough stuff so that you feel safe. And the question that Hamlet asks, whenever it's always waiting for you just off stage left there, and most people fight the hard their whole lives to
mm,
ignore Hamlet's question, and then bang, life can go by in a flash. If you just focus on shopping and eating, life goes by so fast, and then you're dead. And there's dark forces at play who want you to do that. And whenever you want to, you can choose to lean into Hamlet's question and say, uh, what is a man if the chief market of his time be but to sleep and feed? And instead you can jump into that and say, yeah, what is meaningful?
yeah,
And it doesn't matter what the answer is, but if you lean into that and think, um, first off, when you read Shakespeare, you're reminded that you're part of the human race. Sometimes when you're going through hard times, you think you're alone. And Shakespeare reminds you that every human has had the same problems as you do. You have desires that threaten to ruin you if you don't get a hold of them.
mm,
And another reason Shakespeare is so great as a writer is that everyone wants something. where story is about conflict and conflict is about desire.
Mhm.
And the sooner in your writing you can front load the desire, the happier your reader will be. So the narrator of my book, he wants to understand, he wants to be understood. And everyone in Shakespeare is just so sweaty and horny and trembling with desire
Mhm.
that just makes the proceedings so vivid that you're just right there, like immediately, right?
Mhm.
So when you read Shakespeare, you're reminded of things that don't change. So in this book specifically, I was thinking about how um, he could talk about things that are timeless and true, but um, Shakespeare also was always full of joy
Mhm.
and jokes, which is also an important part of life. Like, um, I wouldn't want to write a book without humor in it because
Mhm.
humor is an important part of life and certainly an important part of my day. So, yeah. So I was just sort of thinking, and oh, and also I must say, just from a technical point of view, you know how there are poems that are about something,
Mhm.
and that's the point. And with Shakespeare, every line has a surprise in it. Every single line has something that is worth thinking about, that's funny or just inventive,
Yeah.
or you say something in a different way. Like instead of saying the moon, he'll say the tide's governor, or and sometimes he'll make up a word if he wants to.
Mhm.
Um, like yeah. So I just thought, what if I wrote poems where not only was it about something, but every line has a surprise.
Yeah.
Like you know how movies, how like John Ford, who was a great filmmaker, they said, what makes a great movie?" And he said, two good scenes and no bad ones,
Mhm.
which doesn't make any sense unless you're actually making art, where you realize that your book has building blocks like Lego, where he really thought in terms of scenes, where if every scene has something strong in it and it contrasts with the scenes around it, that's where the magic happens. So poems have these building blocks of lines, and in Shakespeare, every line has its own rewards. So I just thought, what if I just made sure that um, every line had something said in a fresh way, you
Yeah.
know? Like, for example, in that last poem, like when a pine cone hits the ground, it doesn't make a huge noise like a car crash. But I thought, what if it did?
Mhm.
Right. And that's a good way to start a poem to get people's attention, but also to think, yeah, yeah, I've never paid that much attention to a pine cone. But if you think about it, pine cones are pretty crazy. Let's let's think for 10 seconds out of our busy day worrying about Selena Gomez. Let's take 10 seconds and think about, man, pine cones are pretty cool,
Yeah.
you know. So with Shakespeare, you really do get a way to navigate your whole world um, in a way that's inventive and joyful.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like, speak about the relatability of like Shakespeare and just him speaking to things about the human experience. And I feel like that's what your poems do, but more so I feel like each one of your poems, like even the two that we share today, I feel like every line could go off and be its own poem, because I feel like when I'm reading one of your poems, like my mind's trying to figure out like right away synapses are firing, like what's the point of this poem? Where are we going? And as soon as I think I got it, the next line is off in another direction. I'm like, nope,
Wow.
going a different way. Then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I got it. Nope, we're going now. We're going a different way. But I feel like that's the point, and I feel like everybody who reads one of those poems, like the thing about the Dairy Queen,
Yeah.
being mowed down and the condo being built, like that struck me. That might not strike somebody else because
Yeah.
another line might strike somebody else who maybe had a different experience that's more aligned with that. But in that way, the poems are able to speak to a mass amount of people, all of us who have this shared experience. In some way, we can all find a home in these poems. So well done.
Oh, yeah. And also, one of the thrilling things about art is you learn that magically, the more specific you get, the more universal it becomes.
Hmm.
And sometimes amateur writers who are nervous or whatever think they have to pile on the details to make it come alive. When
Mm.
no, it's about choosing the right detail.
Yep.
and you're responding to that Dairy Queen. And the thing is, um, like I said, in art, you realize there are experiences that are common to every human being who's ever lived. So, reading great literature like Homer, Shakespeare, it does make you a better person, makes you more empathetic to your neighbor. But also, it turns out I just noticed that things that happened to me here, they did also. There are readers in Chicago and Baltimore who've had the same sort of experience.
Yep.
And that's a reminder about what it means to be alive, what we all have in common, all that good stuff.
Yep. So good. Darrell, we're just about out of time, but this has been a lot of fun. Thank you for taking time for us. Your work, your poems, they are a gift. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. That was great.
Yeah, for sure. And real quick, where can people go if you want to direct them anywhere to follow you on social media or look up, interact with you anywhere online or
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. My Twitter handle, or I guess it's called X now.
yeah, whatever.
It's yeah, yeah, yeah. The handle is my name. So Darrell Epp. Yeah,
Easy. Easy
yeah.
peasy. I'll put it in the show notes and we'll do this again soon.
Okay, thank you very much.